Hello and welcome to Business Daily. I'm Shin Se-min in for Jaein today. Before we get started, let's get a look at the day's business headlines. The new administration is all hands on deck to create more quality jobs. The president and top economic policymakers hold respective meetings with a focus on improving employment. Saying goodbye to the country's oldest nuclear reactor for good and ushering in an era of green energy. What does this mean for the country's power supply and costs? These stories and more coming right up. President Moon Jae-in chaired his first presidential jobs committee meeting this afternoon. Members of the committee include the vice job creation chief Lee Yong-sup, a former senior official of the ruling Democratic Party, as well as officials from related ministries and representatives of the management and labor unions. In their first meeting, the committee agreed that meetings should be held on a monthly basis and frequently, especially if the president sees a pressing need to convene a session. Members once again emphasize the importance of job creation in boosting the country's economic vitality. Job creation has been the dominant issue of concern for the young administration, especially as the president has been pushing for income-led growth in boosting the overall economy. Korea's top finance and policy officials gathered for the first time today to discuss how they will initiate key economic policies. Our Oh Soo-young with more.
Laying the groundwork for cooperation, Korea's top economic officials gathered on Wednesday to discuss how they will coordinate key initiatives. Finance Minister Kim Dong-yeon sat down with Presidential Policy Chief Jang Ha-sung and Chairman of the Fair Trade Commission Kim Sang-jo for the first time since all three took office. The officials reviewed various risk factors in the domestic economy, such as the unemployment rate and the rising levels of household debt, stressing the urgency of creating quality jobs by winning approval for the government's supplementary budget in Parliament.
We have a two-track situation where various macroeconomic figures show the economy is faring better than before, but the real economy and labour market are struggling. We have many things to work through our gatherings as the finance team.
The finance minister, doubling as deputy prime minister, is expected to assume the leading role in handling economic affairs. Policy Chief Chang expressed his support for the direction Kim is taking on economic democratization initiatives aimed at tackling social inequality and bipolarization.
We understand that Kim will hold the reins in shaping overall economic reforms in corporate governance, finance, labor, and industry.
Meanwhile, the antitrust watchdog chair will likely orchestrate corporate governance reforms, something he and the presidential policy chief have strongly pushed for in the past.
We will initiate corporate reform policies in a way that does not come down on companies like a ton of bricks, but are well measured and rational.
The officials agreed they would strictly punish companies that break market rules, while rewarding those that abide by them by supporting innovation and investment channels. Expressing their commitment to future gatherings, the three parties pledged to convene and discuss pressing matters and deliver a unified and steady stance to the market. Oh Soo-young, Business Daily.
Last year, the public sector recorded a $38 billion surplus, the largest since the records were kept in 2007. The surplus saw its third consecutive annual rise at nearly $10 billion. The Bank of Korea reported total revenue at just under $670 billion, a 4.1% increase on year, with total expenditures coming in at about $630 billion, which was a rise at 2.7%. Public sector accounting is a method of measuring the performance of nonprofit entities in the public sector, where profit margins are an ineffective measurement, including governments and other special corporations. An increase in corporate earnings, a booming real estate market, and a jump in tax revenue all contributed to the increased surplus. Korea's exports in June look likely to stay buoyant. Data from Korea Customs Service shows outbound shipments from June 1st to the 20th are up almost 24.5% on year, hitting $31 billion. While exports showed a downward trend in the first 2 weeks of June, shipments picked up again thanks to booming sales of ships, semiconductors, and petroleum products. The Customs Service says if exports continue to increase at a similar pace for the rest of the month, it'll beat the figures for June last year, making it the 8th consecutive month of on-year exports growth. And moving on to markets, to give us a brief picture of this week's stock market action, we have our Business Daily market contributor Jae-in joining us on the line. Hello, Jae-in.
Thanks for having me.
How are things looking in today's session? A number of negative factors seem to affect the overall sentiment.
Right. The Korean equity market fell for 2 consecutive sessions. The Kospi fell by 0.49% to close at 2357.53, while the Kosdaq followed with a 0.5% downtick to close at 665. Morgan Stanley Capital International, or MSCI, the world's largest indexing firm, said overnight it's planning to add mainland Chinese equities, or A shares, to its emerging market index. The decision spooked overall sentiment due to fears of capital outflows from the Korean market. In particular, foreign investors unloaded massive amounts of shares on the Kospi, dragging down the entire index. Retail investors were the only net buyers. Yesterday, foreigners bought shares on the Kospi, and 76% of shares they bought were Samsung Electronics, the largest stock by market cap. However, they focused on selling shares of the company, and this affected general market performance as well. Most sectors and blue-chip stocks, excluding SK Hynix, the second largest stock on the Kospi, suffered losses during the session. The U.S. market overnight closed with a sluggish picture, with most sectors other than pharmaceuticals and biotechnology ending down as well.
Despite the negative reaction seen throughout today's session, experts still don't seem to think that the MSCI decision will fundamentally drag down the Korean market. What are some of the main reasons behind that?
MSCI said it will add 222 Chinese large-cap shares on a gradual basis starting June next year. And of course, investors might have fears of capital outflows from the Korean market, just as we've witnessed from today's session. However, experts still do not see the decision as a major headwind going forward. Most importantly, experts think there will be enough time for investors to digest the issue because the process will last for years. For example, it took 6 and 9 years, respectively, for MSCI to include 100% market cap of Korea and Taiwan. Likewise, the index provider suggested 10 years as the potential time frame to fully include A shares in its emerging market index. The Korean government shares this opinion too. The Financial Services Commission said China's listing will not have a significant impact on Korean stocks, which are also categorized as emerging market assets. The Commission also said the issue has mostly been priced in the Korean market starting from the beginning of 2017. It did say, however, that up to $3.7 billion worth of foreign capital could flow out of the local market due to overall adjustments in the index.
Then what market factors should investors keep monitoring in the longer term?
For the reasons I just mentioned, experts advise investors to focus on more fundamental factors going forward. One of the things that might become a major headwind is falling oil prices. West Texas Intermediate, or WTI, plummeted again overnight, falling by more than 2%. The closing price was the lowest in 9 months as well. Although major oil producers that agreed on production cuts have kept their pledge, other producers, including Libya and Nigeria, that were excluded from the agreement have been overproducing crude oil. Falling oil prices can create a lot of disruptions in the global commodity markets and equity markets. Another thing is falling expectations for Q2 earnings. The Korean market has been enjoying a decent rally due to better corporate earnings in Q1. However, expectations for Q2 earnings have been rather low, a brief downturn in sluggish exports and falling commodity prices. In this sense, today's announcement by the Customs Agency that exports increased by more than 24% so far in June can offer a sigh of relief for investors for now. This has been Jaein for Business Daily.
These days, people joke that you've got to be rich to be able to crack an egg over your instant noodles. That's how much ordinary people are feeling the pinch with rising food prices and no relief yet in sight. Eunice Kim has more.
How much would it cost to buy ingredients for a braised spicy chicken dish and fried rice? 9,000 won for the chicken, eggs 3,500 won, potatoes 4,000 won, and a few more vegetables add up to 26,000 won even before the shopping is done, reflecting an average shopping cart rise of 23% compared to the same time last year. Egg prices have spiked more than 60% as a result of extensive culling on the back of the avian influenza outbreak, while the drought has raised vegetable prices.
We do struggle when grocery shopping because chicken and egg prices have risen a lot.
According to figures from Statistics Korea, while overall consumer prices rose by 2% last month, that of farm, livestock, and seafood products jumped triple that rate at 6.2%. The parade of rising prices shows no signs of slowing down even under the Jaein government. It's become such an issue that big box markets like E-Mart, to stand apart, are featuring limited-time steep discounts on imported fruits and frozen squid caught in open waters at prices 45% less than squid caught in domestic seas.
We're cutting prices with bulk purchases in advance for fresh food products like squid and onions that are getting more expensive.
This as food manufacturers are buying suspicion of hiking prices on the likes of instant noodles and beverages, even if their production costs are unchanged.
It's difficult to argue that all prices must rise because there's a rising trend. Managing prices will become a key task of the new government.
With the monsoon season upon the country in July and August, the price of fruit and vegetables could hike further, passing on more stress to cost-aware households. Eunice Kim, Business Daily.
Korea's first ever commercial nuclear reactor, Gori-1, was permanently shut down earlier this week. Many see this as a sign that the new Moon Jae-in administration is getting serious about reducing the country's reliance on nuclear power and fossil fuels. It would be a turning point also for a country known for exporting nuclear power-related technology and have extensive economic repercussions. For more on this, we have our Kim Ji-yeon joining us in the studio. Hi, Ji-yeon.
Hello, Jaein.
Tell us more about the government's roadmap for the cleaner energy going forward.
Well, in essence, what the government is trying to do is scrap all plans to build new reactors and not extend operations of aged ones, as seen in the case of the Gori-1. And the government says it will make sure that 11 more power plants are terminated by 2029 and not extended. The initial plan to build 8 new reactors is also being aborted. Also, for the period of 1 month in June, right before the summer peak season starts, 8 out of 10 old coal-fired power plants are being temporarily shut down to lower levels of fine dust. And through these measures, the government says it aims to lower its energy reliance on nuclear power plants from the current 30% to 18% by 2030.
I mean, it all sounds rosy, but it also sounds like the government would need to uproot its energy production system going forward.
Right. There are concerns about the possibility of electricity price hike, and also there's finding alternative energy sources, as well as what impact will have on Korea's export competitiveness in nuclear power plant related technology. Well, first, let's go over the issue of price hikes. Electricity from nuclear power plants is by far the cheapest, and this is why the Korea Energy Economics Institute projects that prices could increase by around 30% if the government follows through with its plan. And on this, the government responded that it will increase the price of electricity used by industry and encourage the use of alternative energy sources to make up for expenses incurred.
And as you said, another issue would be finding an alternative energy sources that emit less greenhouse gases and are more eco-friendly.
Right, and for that, I visited a tidal power plant in Korea to see what kind or how it can provide this issue of energy supply, and it also happens to be the world's largest such facility. Take a look.
An hour's drive away from the capital, Seoul, is the coastal city of Ansan. Here, Korea's one and only operating tidal power plant sits between the border of the West Sea and Siwa Lake. Utilizing seawater stored inside a tidal embankment built at the mouth of the lake, the facility generates and stores electricity through its 10 turbines operating 365 days a year. This sets Siwa apart from other tidal power plants around the world, which usually have 1 or 2 turbines that make use of the tidal gap flowing from one direction.
This tidal power plant produces up to 552 gigawatt-hour of electricity a year, and that's equivalent to the annual amount used by 200,000 households.
Construction for the plant began in 2005 using a seawall set up in 1994 for flood control as part of the country's 1987 Thailand reclamation project to create a freshwater lake for agricultural purposes. But in 2000, this plant was scrapped due to deteriorating water quality, and the government had to repurpose the embankment, eventually leading to tidal power plant operations in 2011. Contrary to previous concerns that the turbines would harm the surrounding environment, efforts by Korea Water Resources Corporation helped restore the area. It's now home to more than 145 bird species and a tourist site attracting more than 1.4 million visitors a year. And it's not just the scenery that makes this plant so special.
The amount of electricity produced by the 10 turbines can replace some 860,000 barrels of fossil fuel used in a year. This means the plant is contributing to the reduction of more than 310,000 tons of carbon dioxide emissions annually.
The plant is undeniably a benchmark for green energy production, but that doesn't mean adding additional plants is an easy option. Potential sites have to undergo intense environmental studies that could take years, not to mention the minimum requirement for tide levels to generate power. Astronomical costs are another issue.
In the case of Germany, after it announced it'll get rid of its nuclear power plants, it increased spending drastically to install green power plants. It's now spending over $23.6 billion annually to replace the reactors so it can meet its energy demand.
Whether Korea would be able to shoulder this kind of cost burden is up for debate. Another area of concern is what implications this would have for the government's past efforts to export technologies in nuclear power generation. Korea's exports to the UAE for constructing and maintaining nuclear power plants there in 2009 amounted to $20 billion. It's estimated the country could reap an additional $20 billion for maintenance and managing nuclear waste for 60 years after construction. But at the other end of the spectrum, some say the full cost benefits of adopting eco-friendly energy sources has not been weighed, especially when it comes to health issues.
Fine dust particles emitted from retiring nuclear reactors and coal-fired power plants contribute to around 2% of total emissions. It may not seem like a lot, but for those residing near the plants, the actual figure hovers at around 10 to 12%, which could be critical in determining one's health and quality of life.
Now, Jaein, rising fine dust levels are surely an important issue for Korea, especially. And to address this issue, the government had adopted the carbon emissions trading system 2 years ago. How is this system going so far? And is there any loopholes that we need to improve going forward?
Right. Korea adopted the system 2 years ago to join global efforts to mitigate climate change and meet their target emissions reduction by 37% of business-as-usual levels by the year 2030. And it's in place, but it's not as active when compared to that of the EU. So a local expert I've interviewed said the government should scrap its price cap while increasing the amount of carbon emissions allotted to companies. Currently, some 600 Korean companies are participating, and an estimated 21,000 tons of emissions are being traded on a daily basis on average. Among the 543 million tons allotted, around 5 million tons of leftover emissions were traded at around $21 a ton in 2016.
So ambitious start, but long way to go. Thank you for that report, Jaein.
No sweat.
Low-income households in Korea are suffering from greater housing cost burdens than those with higher income levels, with more paying rent on a monthly basis instead of relying on large deposits. In light of this, a number of ideas are being floated on how to reduce the rent burdens. Our Lee Joo-young has more.
Korea's housing market was once dominated by lump sum 전세 leases for many years, but recent trends show a shift toward monthly rent. While monthly rent accounted for 45.8% of leases back in 2006, that figure reached 60.5% last year. This means a tighter squeeze on low-income households. According to 2016 data from Korea Institute of Finance, roughly 7 out of 10 low-income households pay monthly rent. The cost burden for poor households is also a lot higher, with the proportion of money set aside for rent rising as income levels get lower. In fact, the ratio of overburdened households spending over 30% of their income on rent was 16 percentage points higher than high-income counterparts, almost hitting 40%. A report released by the Financial Research Institute early this month does indicate a general downward trend in housing burdens overall, but it also highlights the immense pressure low-income households still face in rent payment. The institute recommends the government implement a monthly rent ceiling currently being discussed and says it should prioritize public housing and cheaper properties. There are also growing calls for improved long-term rental housing availability and consistent efforts to ease rent burdens through financial assistance. Lee Joo-young, Business Daily.
Startups in Korea have mostly been concentrated in the IT industry, but more recently, a bunch of noteworthy media entities have been popping up, catering to the ever-evolving needs of a diverse global audience eager to learn more about Korea. These new media players are also stepping up their game for quality journalism. Our Kim Jung-soo reports.
It's said that the media industry in Korea is nearing saturation. That in terms of both content and reach, it's got all its bases covered. But the country's media startups beg to differ. They think there's a lot more room for growth and experimentation. One such startup is Korea Expose, an online-based English news and culture magazine that writes on South Korea with an insider's perspective. Slightly before the site was formally launched in August 2014, its chief founder, Koo Se-ung, submitted a piece called An Assault on Our Children to the New York Times. In it, he talks about the country's hierarchical education system and how it makes students sacrifice happiness for success. The piece went viral and was later translated into Korean by Yonhap News, giving him much-needed confidence about his new project.
Hopefully when people outside Korea see the problem, then they criticize it, maybe it will bring out some kind of reform within South Korea. It was an interesting insight for me to hear, the idea that everybody knows the problem is there, but they don't necessarily talk about it.
They say good students and people in general are products of a good environment, and Korea Expose is one of a handful of companies being incubated by the country's sole media startup accelerator, Mediati. On the same floor with Korea Expose is G Pictures, a two-man company founded by a 21-year-old. G Pictures produces video content targeting the country's young demographic, mostly students. One of its most popular videos dealt with menstruation in schools.
Yes, our students practice so-called democracy in our schools through mock elections, but really, such institutional practices don't mean much in our schools if there isn't an open room for discussion.
Mediati's founder says he is intent on fostering media companies that address previously unrecognized needs.
Korea's traditional media has a lot to be proud of, but I also see how improvements can be made, both in terms of content and accessibility, especially in the current media environment.
Unlike Korea's often problematic educational system, the relationship between startups and Mediati is not an ordinary student-teacher relationship. Koo says it's marked by mutual respect. Mediati is a minority shareholder in the magazine and rarely interferes with decisions regarding content.
Ultimately, we believe in media freedom. I think everybody needs to be able to say what he or she wants in a very free and honest way. But if you get money from particular sources and you become dependent on it, then you are not going to be true to yourself. You have to abide by somebody else's agenda. So that's what we're learning here at Mediati. We are being trained to be independent financially, not just editorially.
I think a good example is the presidential election. We went into depth, focusing on different aspects of the story, and we had a one-on-one interview with Shim Sang-jung, who is a minor political candidate, but she's a very prominent politician nevertheless. But from the perspective of the foreign media, because she's from a minor party, she doesn't merit the sort of coverage that Korea Exposé was able to do.
Ultimately, Koo hopes it can make Korean society realize that it shouldn't be marginalizing its problems, but rather embracing them, a sentiment shared by other media startups as well.
Not a country that is very good at talking openly about problems that it has. This is not just about Korea. There are lots of problems everywhere because this is human nature. Human society is flawed. But in Korea, criticism is not something that is encouraged.
When I see Korean newspapers these days, there are often a flurry of specific details without offering much context. They already assume readers will think the news is important. But with our videos, we try to link the personal with public.
They say that learning takes a lifetime. The common adage in the media is to always be careful of making generalizations, but it appears a growing question is not just to find a balance, but also make deeper connections between the particular and the general, and between the local and the global. Kim Jung-soo, Business Daily.
That does it for this edition of Business Daily, but do tune in again tomorrow for more of the day's top business stories. And until then, goodbye.